Welcome to Stand in the Gap Today with your host, the Honorable Sam Rohrer, President of the American Pastors Network.
Today, this is our recurring Israel, Middle East, and Prophecy Update program with our return guest, Bill Salus, founder of Prophecy Depot Ministries. Now, Bill's also a prolific author and conference speaker and a guest on many radio and TV programs dealing with Israel and prophecy. Now, our title is this: Israeli Elections, Prophecy, and the Pathway to Peace. Now, I don't think you want to miss this program today, as we're going to deal with the challenges and expectations that are huge that now exist before the new Israeli leader, Benjamin Netanyahu. And we're going to talk about as we consider the prospects for peace in that region. We'll detail what God says about a peace plan that will come, and whether or not that peace plan can come by political brokering and negotiation, or whether it comes at the expense of war. Let me welcome to the program right now Bill Salus. Bill, thanks for being back with us today.
Hey, Sam. It's great to be with you and Jamie again.
Bill, these are exciting days. You're out there doing a lot of work, speaking and presenting, and so glad to get you on here today. But this area, this subject today, in the election of Netanyahu, to me, I'm looking at that and saying, what can I compare it to? And I'd say, well, it's more like throwing a big rock into a small puddle, perhaps in a small pebble into a big lake, because expectations are very high, with many evidences and threats of war already coming, which I want to talk to you about. But Bibi's in a tough place at a critical time, it appears. And before we address the focus of today's program, which is biblical prophecy and the pathway to peace in Israel, which the Bible foretells, before we go there in the next segment, I'd like to get your comments here in this segment here on a couple of initial challenges facing Netanyahu. One is this, I want to get your comments on. There was a document that you and I both read. It was an editorial by a leading Jewish leader who was talking about Ukraine's president seeking to put pressure on Israel, which he has been doing, to firmly align with Ukraine and against Russia. Some are out there actually saying that Israel's failure to firmly align with Ukraine and against Russia is driving Russia into alignment with Iran, who is a sworn enemy of Israel. So on that piece, Iran, Russia, Ukraine, any comment on that? And do you see that as a challenge with any kind of prophetical consideration?
It's going to be on Bibi's agenda right up at the top with several other priorities, which I'd like to list in just a moment. But Zelensky was actually one of the people who was forwarding that concern that Israel's reluctance to send them missile defense systems and things has pushed Russia into the Iranian camp. But that's not necessarily the case there. But I do want to say this, Sam, you mentioned it 2 times in the programs, and I think the listeners need to be aware of this. Daniel 2, verse 20 and 21 says, "Blessed is the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his, and he changes the times and the seasons. He removes kings and raises up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding." We're dealing with a changed time, a changed season, and different kings in place. And when you talk about the kings of Israel, at this critical point in Israel's history, there's no more important kings to be looking at than what's going on in Israel right now. And then Netanyahu inherits his position now different than it was before when he was former prime minister. Iran has gone unchecked over the last, since 2018, since Donald Trump withdrew from the JCPOA deal with its nuclear program. They've enriched uranium to 60% and on the verge of having a nuclear weapon if they don't already have one. Matter of fact, Israeli officials were saying several months ago that Iran was just 3 weeks away from having a nuclear weapon. Now, when it comes to the top list of priorities, Bibi's going to have to deal with Iran. And there's concerns that he's going to have to strike Iran. They're already talking about it in his cabinet. And then you move down the pecking order for this, you got the Ukraine thing, and you got the Palestinian thing, you got the Temple Mount thing. So the Ukraine thing is important too because, you know, Benjamin Netanyahu has had a pretty good relationship with Vladimir Putin in the past. Matter of fact, I'm not sure of this, but I think he visited Vladimir Putin about as many times as he visited Barack Obama. And the reason for that was because back then, Russia was involved in the Syrian Revolution, and Israel wanted to make sure that they were clear to go forward and continue to make air sorties and strikes in Syria because of the flow of weapons coming from Iran through Syria into Hezbollah. So he made several visits to Vladimir Putin. He's also very concerned about, they still need to keep bombing in Syria because that flow of weapons is still coming. There's also Jews now being held hostage in Russia. So politically, he's got some concerns about how he's going to be able to deal with Ukraine. Militarily, he's got concerns too because he doesn't want to give missile defense systems and things into the Ukraine arena because that's a battle testing ground. They'll be able to test and steal the technologies and things like that. Also, there's a short supply of Iron Dome and missile defense systems available to Bibi Netanyahu. So he's going to have concerns about that. But the other issue that's going to be a big concern because the religious right now has gotten a big foothold in the coalition Bibi's going to put together, and that's concerns over the Temple Mount and the Palestinian situation, the confrontation between the Jews and the Palestinians, Dan.
Well, Bill, you mentioned the Temple Mount. I want to just dig a little deeper on that. Officials in Jordan have even given some warnings to Netanyahu to not open up access. Explain to the people what that is, why that's important, how that plays within the interior conflict there in Israel.
Well, I'm going to borrow a phrase from my dear friend Eric Stakelback, who's a host of a TBN show, and he said, Jerusalem is the center of the earth, and the Temple Mount is the most coveted real estate in the world. And the Temple Mount has been controlled since 1967 by Jordan. They've been the custodians over it. When Israel won that Six-Day War, they made the grand mistake of giving Jordan control over that. Now, that control is pretty much centered with the government of Jordan, which is ruled by the Hashemite Kingdom, which is not Palestinian. There's presently about half of the population in Jordan is Palestinian, and if the minute that the Hashemite Kingdom lose control over the Temple Mount, which is being threatened right now, the Hashemite Kingdom rulership of King Abdullah are going to be under a big threat and jeopardy. Now, with this the new guy Ben Gvir coming in with the religious right, who wants to be involved with the public security minister, which would have control over the Temple Mount, he's wanting to have more Jewish accents to the Temple Mount. He was wanting to have Jews pray on the Temple Mount. Right now, the Jews are not really allowed to pray there. As a matter of fact, if they wanted to pray up there, what they were doing was throwing some coins on the ground so they could bow down and act like they were picking them up, or they were talking on their cell phone, fake phone calls, so they could pray to their God, because they're not allowed to do that. Also, they're building a train that's going to go from Tel Aviv through Ben Gurion Airport to the Temple Mount and bring millions of tourists into the Temple Mount from 70 different nations. So we're talking about things that are going to happen in the Temple Mount, which is going to probably create a war. And there's a few headlines out there. I'm going to read you a couple headlines. Jordan said to warn incoming government against touching Temple Mount status quo, which is definitely going to be threatened right now. The outgoing party from this guy named Ram from the outgoing Arab party that lost in the election says allowing Jewish prayer on the Temple Mount will lead to war. Fire on the Mount, the new government might shift policy at the flashpoint, the holy site. The point being is that every time there's something going on in the Temple Mount, the Jordanian parliament reviews and considers shredding that peace agreement they have with Israel since 1994. So that's just another thing Bibi's going to have to deal with.
Okay, that's great. And ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go further on the Temple Mount issue in the last segment because it is so very critical. Bill, just some comment on this. Some of the neighbors of Israel, Saudi Arabia and some of the others, they're not so fearful about the ascension of Netanyahu, are they?
Well, they're concerned, as is the whole Arab world, because if they start to threaten they're all still pro-Palestinian. Matter of fact, the Saudis are floating they put the Saudi Peace Initiative out in 2002, which was basically a two-state solution, but now they've gone to this new plan they are endorsing in June of this year, but called the Hashemite Kingdom of Palestine, where they actually want to have Jordan connect with the West Bank, with the Palestinians there, onto the Gaza where the Hamas are, with a contiguous pathway to get through those places. So they're all still very concerned about that. But the thing is, the Temple Mount is in Jerusalem, which is the third holiest site in Islam. And if you threaten that or take away control of that from the Muslim world, the Palestinians are going to go crazy because that's their high point. In other words, yeah, we're Palestinian refugees. We're trapped in the West Bank. Matter of fact, Jordan keeps them trapped in the West Bank with their immigration policies for their own purposes because they don't want to assimilate all these Palestinian refugees. They want them to have this feeling that they have a right of return. If you take away the control of the Temple Mount, the Palestinians in the West Bank, even the Palestinian citizens inside of Israel, and also the Palestinian refugees scattered throughout Lebanon, Syria, and elsewhere, they're going to flip out. And you're going to see probably another intifada, if not leading to a major war, which I personally think this is maybe where this is going, because the Bible has no shortage of prophecies talking about a war.
Okay, and hold that, Bill. When we come back, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to move into that area. And that area, the theme of this next little segment is God's plan for peace. Is it through war or negotiation? Peace, the object in the Middle East for a long time. We know biblically it will come. We'll talk about how it will come. Since 1948 and the official rebirth of the nation of Israel, multiple presidents, nearly all of them since that point, have attempted to initiate some type of a framework for peace in the Middle East. And most all have involved land for peace. You've heard that phrase, meaning they've had as a part of it the requirement for peace that Israel agrees to the creation of a two-state solution, they would call it, two-state plan, actually by having to give up land promised to Israel by God and give it to the Palestinians, to whom God did not promise land. And thus far, all plans have failed. The most current framework for peace is probably the Abrahamic Accord drafted by Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, as we remember. The framework for this plan moved earlier this year into an adopted position where Jordan and Saudi Arabia and Israel agreed in theory to that agreement. And I'm going to put it in legislative terms. It now sits on the table for future consideration at the United Nations. It was put there for a vote, and they chose not to vote on it. That was not all that long ago. But thus far, no peace plan has been achievable by political brokering. The question is peace achievable, however, by war? It's a different thing. Well, the key is, what does God say about that? The question is, how and when does this peace come about that the Bible speaks? And lay out, if you could, the chronology of events from where we are now to the time of what the Bible says about peace. So build this out as you will.
Very good. I'd love to give the biblical and prophetic perspective to what you just asked. First of all, I do feel the need to apologize for speaking so fast and so long in that last segment, but it's hard to unpack all the Middle East impacting, globally impacting events that Bibi Netanyahu is going to have to face now at this point in time on the end times line.
Okay.
So please accept my apologies on that. I tend to speak quick when I've got so much to say. But with respect to the Arab, the Abraham Accords peace plan, basically all that really was a two-state solution. Even those countries, UAE and Bahrain, etc., their underlying motivations were to have a two-state solution. And that's what Joe Biden wants, and that's what some in Israel want. But Bibi Netanyahu is opposed to that. He was opposed to that, and he will still be opposed to that. Matter of fact, when the Hashemite Kingdom of Palestine plan got forwarded and got in the front press in June of this year, Joe Biden immediately rejected it because he wants a two-state solution. But the comment you made, which is really telling and poignant, is that peace is not always established through politically brokered deals, especially in this case, land for peace deals, two-state solutions. That's failed miserably throughout the past presidential, Bush, Clinton, Obama, etc. But sometimes peace is achieved militarily. When you take out your enemies, you can then live at peace. And the reason it's important to keep an eye on what's about to happen in the Temple Mount right now, the status quo is probably going to be changed here. We're speculating, but it's probably going to be changed here, and probably relatively soon. And we know that has to happen because ultimately there's going to be a third Jewish temple built there, so that means that definitely will change the status quo. And I think when this starts to happen, you're going to have some prophecies start to find fulfillment, and this could happen into the next year, 2023. One of the prophecies that we need to look at is in Jeremiah and Zechariah 12, verse 2, it says, "Behold, I will make Jerusalem a cup of trembling," or in some translations, dizziness or intoxication, unto all the people around about when they siege both against Judah and against Jerusalem. If you strip control of the Temple Mount away from the Muslims, they will try to lay siege on it because it's the third holiest site in Islam, and I think we're going to see that in that direction. And what happens? It says later on in Zechariah, it says, here's how this will be resolved in this militarily. Zechariah 12:6 says, in that day, and that's the day where they're laying siege on Judah and Jerusalem, I will make the IDF, the captains of Judah, like a firepan in the woodpile, and like a fiery torch in the sheaves, and they shall devour all the surrounding peoples on the right hand and on the left. But Jerusalem shall be again inhabited in her own place, Jerusalem. So it pictures a war between the Arabs and the Jews that sort of gets sparked and catalyzed by this push for seizing Judah and Jerusalem and trying to maintain control, I believe, of the Temple Mount. And the Israeli Defense Forces exist in fulfillment of biblical prophecy. We've talked about this on your programs in the past. In numerous biblical prophecies, time permitting, we can go through a couple of those. But the point being is that the Israeli Defense Forces are going to achieve the peace that Israel needs in the Middle East, because they will have no choice. Because the Arabs are they're going to confederate. We talked about this in Psalm 83 and elsewhere. They're going to want to wipe Israel off the map. They're going to want to take the Promised Land. This has been their goal ever since Israel became a nation. This was their goal in 1948, the war in 1967, and also in 1973, the Yom Kippur War. So, I mean, time permitting, Sam, we can get in a little deeper into this stuff, but I'm looking for military activity to happen, and a strike against Iran more than likely in 2023, more than likely. Israel can't wait any longer. I believe that would lead to a proxy war against Israel with Syria, Hezbollah, Hamas, and Iran's other proxies. It becomes a whole different environment over there, and I think God's got Bibi Netanyahu and his religious right in position now to handle that war. They'll fight it, and they'll win it, and that's what the prophecies talk about.
Bill, I think you just mentioned Psalm 83. I know in former programs you've also alluded to it, but I think you've said that it really holds the key to this potential war that might be triggered by some of the warnings of Israel's neighbors and the election of Netanyahu. Would you just talk about that for a moment and outline God's plan for peace and how God now lays that all out?
Yeah, absolutely. Just a brief summary, Reader's Digest on Psalm 83 for those who didn't listen to the former programs or are not familiar with it. It talks about an Arab confederacy of those people on the right hand and the left hand that surround Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, the Palestinians, the Hamas, Jordan, Egypt, we believe is in there as well, that are going to confederate and come together with a devious plan to wipe the nation of Israel off the map, that the name of Israel will be remembered no more. And the psalm goes on to talk about how militarily the writer Asaph, who is a prophet, he says, deal with them, militarily, if you read the prophecy correctly. So what we find out here is that the land for peace plan was God's plan initially, and let me explain that because that's going to need some explanation. He had a plan for peace in the Middle East when he would promise to bring the Jews back in the land, which was fulfillment of prophecy in 1948, numerous prophecies. And he said in Jeremiah chapter 12, verses 14 and 15, the Lord says, against my evil neighbors, which is interesting, who touch the inheritance which I have caused my people Israel to inherit, behold, I will pluck them out of their land and pluck out the house of Judah from among them. So he's going to pull out the Arabs that were living in it's going to be Israel, and he's going to pull out the Jews that were living in the Arab lands and bring them back to the new Israel, restored Israel. It says, then after I pluck them out, I will return and have compassion on them and bring them back, everyone to his heritage. And we saw this happening. We saw the Arabs getting their states, Egypt in 1922, Iraq 1935, Syria in 1946, I believe it was Jordan 1946. God was moving around. He was sovereignly plucking out the Arabs, giving their states back, bringing the Jews into the land, and having compassion on them. But he goes on to say, and this is the pivotal part of where we're going now, but it shall be if they learn carefully the ways of my people to swear by my name, not Allah, but Jehovah, as the Lord lives, as they taught my people to swear by Baal. Back in Jeremiah's time, they were worshiping their they were sacrificing their children to the false god Baal. In other words, that was a really bad time when they were worshiping Baal. Then they shall be established in the midst of my people. But if they do not obey, which they're not obeying, they're out of compliance, I will utterly pluck up and destroy that nation. So the point being is that God had a plan. He moved the Arab states into positions. He put the Arabs back into those states. And all he asked in return for that great sovereign activity of having compassion on everybody was that they would worship him. And they're not. They're worshiping Allah. They're trying to take the Holy Land. They want to wipe Israel off the map, according to Psalm 83. Iran wants to wipe Israel off the map. You know, at some point, God's going to say, I'm done. I'm over. I'm going to move forward. And when you start seeing those prophecies happening where God is moving forward through the Israeli Defense Forces, he's executing his fury and his vengeance. So our long-suffering God has been very patient up to this point. But the prophecies are going to find fulfillment. And I think what I'm watching real closely now is that are we about at that point now where God is going to say, okay, now it's time. I've given the opportunity, ample time, war after war. There's no two-state solution going to happen. I've already tried to do my land for peace still in Jeremiah 12. Now it's time to move on and get rid of the problem. And I think that's where we're headed, you guys.
And ladies and gentlemen, and into that comes obviously the election we're just talking about, and all these immediate threats of war if anything is done to the Temple Mount. So we're going to go back now and wrap up the program again by visiting the Temple Mount, because it is really smack right in the middle of all of these things we're talking about as a potential motivation. We'll be back in just a moment. As we go into the final segment now, again, the primary theme today has been Israeli elections. We've talked about that. Netanyahu back in office, a known quantity, a strong leader, but faced with a myriad of challenges, some of them even threats of war. And in the middle of that, as we've been talking with Bill Salus today, is the fact that Israel is in the center of biblical prophecy. So what we are watching, as we just talked about, the alignment of nations around Israel and the pressures that are coming to bear, you can find it literally lift right off the pages of Scripture. So this is a really, really critical time. But with the return to power of Netanyahu, is the rise to greater influence also of what is often referred to as the ultra-conservative or the religious Orthodox Jews, who now make up a significant portion of the Netanyahu ruling coalition, made up of 64 members right now. So it's a good coalition, but they're a part of it. And for this group, the return to sacrifices and a rebuilt temple of necessity includes the very controversial Temple Mount, now overseen by, of all people, as we've heard, the Jordanians. So the question is, how demanding will this group of Jews be? Will they influence Netanyahu's policies? Will there be a move to do something to the Temple Mount that will incur the response of those who are threatening? And how does this combination perhaps fit into biblical prophecy of future events? So we've talked a little bit about this, but Bill, let's go back into that right now. Based on what you know and what you're observing, how much of an issue will the Temple Mount be? And I'm going to put a time frame in on it again. How soon may this issue drive some point of next transition or conflict?
Well, the Temple Mount status quo, as we talked about previously, is got to change because the Jews will build their temple. We find that in numerous prophecies, Revelation 11, verses 1 through 2, 2 Thessalonians 2. The Antichrist is going to go in there and stand in the holy place. He's going to set up this abomination, desolation, etc. There's no shortage of verses that talk about there'll be a third temple. But how is that going to come to fruition, especially in light of the fact that the Muslims have control and Jordan's a custodian of the Temple Mount? And Israel and Jordan have a fragile peace treaty that was formulated in 1994. But we find the answers are in the Bible prophecies. So, for instance, we're told in Jeremiah 49 that at some point there's going to come a time where Jordan is going to shred that peace treaty. And like I said earlier, every time the Temple Mount comes under threat, Jordan's parliament talks about shredding that peace treaty. But this will result in a war. It says there's a war coming to Amman, which is the capital of Jordan. It's in Jeremiah 49, verse 2. And it says that city will become a desolate mound, and her villages will be burned with fire, and Israel will take possession of his inheritance, that's part of the promised land God gave to Abraham through his descendants, which would go from the river of Egypt, probably the Nile, to the river Euphrates. This is in Genesis 15:18. Other prophecies in Zephaniah 2 say the same thing. There'll be a war in Jordan, and Israel will move in. So what's going to happen is once Israel wins the war against the Arabs, we talked about in Zechariah 12, verse 6, they're going to feel pretty free and footloose and fancy free, to say it, probably a bad coinage of a term, to start making movement toward building their temple, because now they've taken out the custodians of the temple, the Waqf of Jordan, and they have the ability now to move forward. But they will have problems because the Muslim world will be in an uproar. And that's why they have to negotiate to build their temple. We find out in Revelation 11 they're actually negotiating with Gentiles to build that temple. But the way they're going to get to the step-by-step to there, and I think we're seeing that this probability is starting to stage set right now, is they're going to take Jordan out of the picture. And when they take Jordan out of the picture in the war, with these prophecies fulfillment, they will have the ability to start making plans of their own on the Temple Mount and what they want to do. And I think that's when you get into the deeper issues with Psalm 83 and the other Arab world concerns. So, I think what your listeners need to be aware of is that, things could change very rapidly in a war scenario, a war-torn area in the Middle East, even this next year or in the very near future. These prophecies are going to happen. The question is when and how. But that temple is going to be built. And they've already got the red heifers over there, which is in the book of Numbers, says they had to have a pure, unblemished red heifer for purification ceremonies and sacrifices. And the temple that we do in sacrifices again. If time permitting, you want to talk about those as well, Sam?
Well, Jamie, let's get a question in. We've got about 4 minutes left, or a little bit less than that. Another question to follow up on here while we have time.
Well, yeah, Bill, I don't think our listeners fully understand why this time with Netanyahu will be different in regards to the aligning themselves with these conservative Jews. This time is much different than any time else before when he has assumed power, because of these religious Jews now wanting and desiring something like retaining the Temple Mount again. Isn't that the case?
It is, and the country voted for this right wing, and especially with the religious right wing section in it. The Arab left wing is pretty much out now, so the Arabs don't have much of a voice now in the Knesset. They voted for that, and they're looking for another Tel Aviv in the West Bank. I mean, there's a movement shift here. But Ben-Gvir, who wants to control the Temple Mount, who wants to be put forward as the public security minister, we need to watch him, because he's liable to start making moves in the direction of changing the status quo. And ultimately that temple will be built, because when the temple's built, the Jews are going to be, the Jews, as your listeners are probably familiar with, nationally, they don't believe that Jesus is the Messiah. They're still waiting for the Messiah to come. And they'll still be doing the animal sacrifices and things like that, like they did with the law of Moses. And that's why the temple priests are getting ready. They've got the implements all prepared. They got the table of showbread. They got all the right implements and fixtures and everything, and now they got the red heifer, and they're going to want to start doing the animal sacrifices, because that was part of the Mosaic law. And they believe one of the main themes of why they want to build the temple is they believe that when they build the temple, it will hasten the coming of their Messiah, not realizing that he was Jesus Christ and he already came 2,000 years ago. So they're going to move forward, and they can do those as quickly as available on an altar. They can put an altar in that Temple Mount area, and then they'll build a temple around that at some point, and some people say that could be done as soon as 6 months, maybe a year on the outside. So how soon are all these things going to happen? They will happen. Sacrifices will occur. This is all in the Bible prophecies. But I guess my question is, I'm watching this real closely. I've been watching this for a long time. And I've written about this at length in my books and things like that. And I've prayed to God for years, like, when are you going to curse those that curse Israel? I mean, these Arabs around there. When are these prophecies going to find fulfillment? And finally, about a year ago, I got this small, gentle voice in my ear that said, Bill, what part of a long-suffering God that I am don't you understand? And I realized at that point that it's God's long-suffering, in my estimation, that has prevented these prophecies from finding fulfillment. But the time is coming where God's going to have to do these prophecies. He's going to have to use the IDF and empower them to win war and create peace.
And with that, Bill, we're out of time. Wow. Thank you for being here. Jamie, thanks for being on. Ladies and gentlemen, Bill's website, prophecydepot.com. A lot of this information has a lot of stuff. You can go there and get it. You can pick up this program again on our website, standinthegapradio.com.